You will remarry Mrs. Cross. That is final." Eliza didn't flinch. She stood at the center of that council room with her jaw set like iron and her hands still at her sides, and she looked every one of those men dead in the eye. "My husband is 3 weeks in the ground," she said, "and you're standing here telling me who I belong to next." Councilman Briggs didn't blink. "We're telling you how Silver Ridge survives, with or without your blessing." That was when she heard the door open behind her. That was when she heard his name, Jonah Hale. If this story already has your heart racing, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow every part of this story to the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The council room in Silver Ridge had never felt smaller. Eliza Cross had walked into that building believing she still had a choice. She walked in carrying the name of her dead husband like a shield. Sheriff Daniel Cross, the man who had kept this town breathing for 11 years, thinking that a widow's grief still bought her something. A little time, a little dignity, maybe just the simple right to be left alone. She was wrong. There were 6 men seated at that long table. 6 men she had known her entire adult life. Men who had eaten at her table, shaken Daniel's hand, tipped their hats to her at church on Sundays. Now they sat across from her with their eyes flat and their mouths pressed into firm apologetic lines that weren't apologetic at all. And Councilman Gerald Briggs, who had been the first to speak at Daniel's graveside service, told her she was going to be married again before the month was out. "This is not a punishment," Briggs said carefully. "This is a matter of stability, for you and for Silver Ridge. Stability." Eliza let the words sit in the air between them. "My husband hasn't been buried a full month, and you're talking to me about stability. Your husband left debts, Mrs. Cross." That was Warren Cutler, the man to Briggs's right, a banker by trade and a coward by nature. He shuffled the papers in front of him without meeting her eyes. "The ranch is mortgaged to a degree most people in this town are not aware of. The land, the stock, the water rights. If you cannot service that debt, and a loan, you cannot, the bank will move to collect. The property reverts. You are left with nothing." She already knew about the debt. She had found the ledgers herself 3 days after the funeral, when she'd sat down at Daniel's desk to understand what exactly she had inherited. The numbers had made her stomach drop. But she had told herself she would find a way. She had told herself that because she had no other choice. "So your solution," she said, "is to sell me off to clear it." Briggs's jaw tightened. "We are offering you protection." "You're offering me a transaction." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "Who is it? Which one of you decided to be charitable enough to take the sheriff's widow off your hands?" The silence that followed was 3 seconds too long. Then the door behind her opened. She heard the boots, first slow, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of footsteps that didn't ask anyone's permission to enter a room. She turned, because she couldn't help it, and the man who walked through that door was not what she expected. Jonah Hale was not old. That surprised her. She had known his name for years without ever attaching a face to it, the way you know the name of a storm system before it arrives. You understand. It's serious, without yet knowing how serious. He was broad in the shoulder, lean everywhere else, and he moved with the particular stillness of a man who has spent a great deal of time alone in places where making noise gets you killed. His hat was in his hand. His eyes, when they found her, were the color of Winter Creek water, gray and still, and giving nothing away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he's already agreed to solve. She turned back to the council. "You already asked him." "Mr. Hale came to us," Briggs said. That was unexpected enough to stop her cold. She looked back at Jonah Hale. "Why?" she said. Just that. One word. He didn't answer right away. He pulled out the chair beside the door, sat down, set his hat on his knee, and said, "Because the alternative is worse." "For who?" "For you." The certainty in his voice made her angrier than anything the council had said. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "I don't." Then how would you know what's worse for me? He looked at her steadily. Because I know the men who are going to come for this land if you're standing on it alone, and I know what they do to women who stand in their way. He paused. I'm offering you a boundary they'll respect, that's all. Eliza looked at this man, this stranger, who spoke about her life with the calm authority of someone reading a weather report, and she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition. The recognition that he was probably right, and the fury that came with knowing it. She turned to Briggs. And if I refuse? Briggs folded his hands on the table. Then the bank proceeds. The land is gone by spring, and you have no say in what happens to it or who takes it over. He let that land before he added, we would prefer a different outcome. She stood in that room for a long moment. She thought about the ranch, the one she had worked beside Daniel for 9 years, the one she had planted and fenced and bled on in ways Daniel never had. She thought about the horses, the well they'd dug themselves, the kitchen garden she'd started from seeds her mother sent from Missouri. She thought about all the things that were supposed to be hers. Then she said very quietly, I want it in writing, every condition, every arrangement. And I want my own signature to mean something, not just his. Briggs nodded. Of course. She looked at Jonah Hale one last time. He was watching her with that same flat, unreadable expression. She could not tell if it was respect or indifference. Don't mistake this for anything it isn't, she told him. I won't, he said. She believed him. She wasn't sure yet whether that made things better or worse. The wedding took place on a Thursday. There were no flowers. Eliza had been specific about that. She'd told Pastor Greer the moment he mentioned them firmly, and without elaboration, that there would be no flowers. She wore a dress she already owned, dark green, practical, nothing that could be mistaken for celebration. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Jonah said the words in a voice that was level and clear, without warmth and without resistance, as if he were reading items from a supply list. Eliza said her own words, looking straight ahead, not at him, not at the small cluster of townspeople who had turned up on the steps outside to watch. Afterward, Martha Greer pressed Eliza's hand and said, God has a plan, dear. Eliza thanked her and walked to the wagon without looking back. The ride out to the ranch was 7 miles on a road she knew by heart. She had ridden it 1,000 times. This time, sitting beside a man she did not know, 7 miles felt like crossing a continent. Jonah didn't speak for the first 4 miles. Neither did she. The horses knew the way. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but it was at least honest, two people not pretending to be something they weren't. Then he said, I'll take the room at the end of the hall. I won't come into yours. I know you won't, she said. Another mile passed. I'll handle the stock in the mornings, he said. You can keep whatever arrangement you've already got for the rest. I milk before sunrise, she said. I won't wait for you. I didn't ask you to. She turned to look at him, then just briefly, just enough to read his profile. He was watching the road. His hands on the reins were steady. Why did you really agree to this? She said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I told you. You told me something. I'm asking if it was the truth. He glanced at her sideways. For just a moment, something shifted behind those gray eyes. Something that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. It's part of the truth, he said. She filed that away. She didn't push it. Not yet. The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. She rose at 4:30, the same as always. She lit the stove, set the coffee, pulled her boots on in the dark. She was halfway across the yard toward the barn when she found that the barn door was already open, the lantern inside already lit. She stopped in the doorway. Jonah was at the far end, working quietly in the way of someone who'd been up for an hour already, and he had already grained the horses and was moving through the milking with a competence that surprised her. He didn't look up. She stood there a moment. Then she went to the second stall and started her own work without comment. They didn't speak that morning, or the one after, but gradually, without either of them deciding to, a rhythm developed. He took the heavy lifting. She managed the particulars she'd always managed. They ate at the same table and passed things to each other, the bread, the salt, the coffee pot, without ceremony and without the awkward politeness that would have been worse than silence. But the town wasn't going to let them disappear into that rhythm. Agnes Pruitt came by on the 8th day under the pretense of returning a pie dish she claimed she'd borrowed from Eliza before Daniel died. Eliza had no memory of the pie dish, but she accepted it. Agnes stayed 45 minutes, and in those 45 minutes, she managed to ask approximately 17 questions, framed as observations, including a pointed remark about how quickly Eliza seemed to be adjusting, delivered with a smile that had teeth in it. After Agnes left, Jonah came in from the yard, looked at the pie dish sitting on the counter and said, "What was that about?" "She wanted to see if we sleep in the same room," Eliza said flatly. He picked up the pie dish, turned it over in his hands, set it back down. "And what did you tell her?" "I didn't tell her anything. I offered her coffee and talked about the weather until she ran out of excuses to stay." Eliza looked at him. "This is how it works here. You should know that. I've been ranching 12 miles outside of town for 6 years, he said. People here don't talk to me. They will now." She paused. "They'll talk about both of us, and none of it will be kind and most of it will be wrong, and there is nothing we can do except not give them anything real to work with." He looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before." "I've been a woman in a small town my whole life," she said. "I've been doing this since I was 15. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. Not pity. Something closer to a grudging acknowledgement. Like a man recalibrating a calculation he thought he'd already finished. He nodded once and went back outside. It was on the 14th night that she first understood something was wrong. Not between them, that wrong at least was a known quantity, a familiar discomfort she was learning to navigate. What she understood that night was something else entirely. She had gone through Daniel's desk again. She did it periodically, working through the papers in methodical order, trying to untangle the full scope of what he'd left her. She had already found the debts. She had already found the receipts and the correspondence with the bank. But that night in the bottom drawer behind a false panel, she had never noticed before, she found a different kind of paper. A letter. Unsigned. Written in a hand she didn't recognize. It said, "You cannot keep this up. We have been patient. But patience has a limit, and yours ran out in August. Make the arrangement, or we will make it for you." It was dated 6 weeks before Daniel died. Eliza sat very still for a long time. Then she heard the creak of boots in the hallway, Jonah coming back inside from checking the south fence line, and she folded the letter carefully, held it in her hand, and said nothing. She needed to know more before she said anything to anyone, including him. Especially him. Because the question that had dropped into her mind like a stone into still water was one she couldn't unhear. Jonah Hale had come to that council meeting himself. He had offered. He had said he knew the men who were going to come for this land. How did he know that? What exactly did Jonah Hale know about Silver Ridge, and about her dead husband, that he hadn't told her? She pressed the letter flat between her palms and listened to his footsteps stop outside her door. He knocked twice the way he always did when he needed to tell her something about the ranch. "South fence is down along the creek," he said through the door. "I'll fix it at first light." "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady. "Good night," he said. She waited until his footsteps reached the end of the hall, until she heard his door close. Then she looked down at the letter in her hands, and something that had been a low, quiet worry in the back of her chest since the first day she'd walked into that council room rearranged itself into something sharper. Daniel had known something was coming, and somehow so had Jonah Hale. The question that kept her awake until the gray hour before dawn was not whether her forced marriage was a convenience or a rescue. It was whether the man at the end of that hallway was her protector, or whether he was part of the reason she needed protecting. She didn't sleep. That letter sat in the drawer of her nightstand like a lit coal. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop turning it over in her mind, parsing every word of it against everything she thought she knew about Daniel, about the council, about the careful, deliberate way Jonah Hale had walked into that room and offered himself up as her solution. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, she had made herself one promise: she would not show her hand until she understood the board. She was at the stove when Jonah came in from the barn. She heard him knock the mud from his boots at the door, heard the familiar sound of him pouring his own coffee from the pot she'd already set out. She kept her back to him and turned the pan without comment. "Ground's still frozen along the creek," he said. "Going to make the fence work harder than it should be." "It's always frozen that time of year," she said. "I'll manage it." "I know you will." She set a plate on the table without looking at him. "Eat before you go back out." He sat. She sat across from him. They ate the way they always ate, efficiently, without performance, like two people who had long since stopped pretending meals were social occasions. But this morning she was watching him. Not obviously. Not the way he'd notice. She was watching him the way she'd learned to watch Daniel in the last year of their marriage, when she'd started to understand that the man across the table from her was carrying things he hadn't told her about. She had been too slow to read Daniel. She would not make that mistake again. "Jonah," she said, and the sound of his first name in her mouth was still foreign enough that it made him look up. "How did you know Tom Reardon was going to come after this land?" He set his fork down, not dramatically, just set it down quiet, the way a careful man sets something down when he needs his hands free to think. "I didn't say Reardon specifically. You said men would come for this land if I were standing on it alone. Men plural who you seem to know something about." She kept her voice even. "I'm asking how." He looked at her steadily. "Silver Ridge isn't as quiet as it pretends to be." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up. She could hear it working at the corner of the house. She watched him, and he watched her, and neither of them looked away. Then he said, "Your husband made enemies. Not because he was a bad sheriff, because he was a good one." He picked his fork back up. "That's all I'm going to say right now." It wasn't enough. She knew that, and he knew that, and there was an understanding between them right there over those two plates on that plain wooden table that this conversation was not finished. It was only paused. He was giving her the edge of a thread, and she would have to decide whether to pull it. She pulled it. "Did you know him, Daniel?" Jonah's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I knew of him." "That's different from knowing him." "Yes," he said. "It is." She let it go. For now. But the letter in her nightstand was all she thought about for the rest of that day. Sure, Tom Reardon came to the ranch 11 days later. She was in the yard when she heard the horses, and she recognized him before he was close enough to speak. Tom Reardon, who owned the largest spread of land on the eastern side of Silver Ridge, who had shaken her hand at Daniel's funeral and said all the right things with all the wrong eyes. He was with two other men she didn't know, and all three of them had the easy, presumptuous posture of people who do not expect to be refused. She didn't move from where she was standing. "Mrs. Hale," Reardon said, touching his hat brim. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been practiced until it no longer resembled warmth. "Wanted to come by and offer my congratulations. Better late than never." "It's been 3 weeks," she said. "Time gets away from you." He looked around the yard, a slow, proprietary kind of look that made her skin tighten. "Place is holding up well." "Yes," she said. "It is." "Your new husband around? He's working." Reardon nodded slowly. "I'll get to the point then. I've got an offer on this property. A fair one, more than fair, I'd say, given the debt situation. You'd walk away clean, no liens, nothing following you. That's not nothing. Eliza looked at him. This property isn't for sale. Well, now, Mrs. Hale, I think it might be worth discussing with your husband before you. I said it isn't for sale. She said it the same way the second time. Same volume, same register, not a trace of heat in it. Is there anything else? Reardon's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Something went flatter, quieter, the way a dog goes quiet right before it's done deciding. I hope you'll reconsider. This is a business matter. No reason for it to get complicated. I don't find it complicated at all, she said. Good day, Mr. Reardon. She held her ground. She didn't move, didn't look away, didn't give him a single inch of reaction to build on. And after a long moment, she felt in her back teeth, he tipped his hat again and turned his horse around. She waited until they were out of the yard before she let herself exhale. Behind her from the barn doorway, Jonah said, How long has he been coming around? She turned. He was standing in the door, which meant he'd been there for at least part of it. She didn't know whether to be grateful or irritated. That was the first time. It won't be the last. He walked toward her, and he was looking in the direction Reardon had gone, with an expression she couldn't fully read, not quite anger, not quite something else, something more controlled and more dangerous than anger. What did he offer? Enough to clear the debt and leave us with nothing. That's how those offers work. She looked at him directly. You know him. It wasn't a question. Jonah stopped beside her, still watching the road. I know his type, he said. Men who buy land the way other men collect debts. They're patient and they're methodical, and they don't stop because you say no. Then what stops them? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, making it clear that no is permanent. There was something in the way he said it, not a threat, not a boast, just a statement of practical fact that made her study his face from the side. He still hadn't told her everything. She still didn't know what thread connected him to Daniel's enemies or to her dead husband's hidden letter. But she understood standing in that yard, in that cold, clear air, that whatever Jonah Hale's reasons were for being here, he was not afraid of Tom Reardon. And right now, that counted for something. All right, she said. She didn't thank him. He wouldn't have wanted her to. They went back inside, and she didn't take the letter out of the drawer. The whispers started getting louder around the fourth week. She heard them in fragments at the dry goods store at the post office once from a woman she'd considered a friend for years, who looked at her across a church pew with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite condemnation, but landed somewhere between them like a stone. People in Silver Ridge had made up their minds about the marriage before she'd had a chance to show them anything, and what they'd decided was this. Either Eliza Cross had moved on too fast, which made her unfeeling, or she'd wanted to move on all along, which made her worse. She told herself it didn't matter. She'd been telling herself things like that for years. But it was the afternoon she overheard two women talking in the Mercantile, not quietly enough about whether Jonah Hale had married the widow for the land and the water rights, that something in her chest pulled tight in a way that surprised her. Not because she believed it, but because she realized with a clarity that was almost inconvenient that the idea bothered her on his behalf, that she was angry for him, not just for herself. That was new. She bought her flour and her salt and left without speaking to either woman. That evening at the table she said, I heard something in town today. Jonah looked up from the ledger he'd been going through. He'd taken to doing her accounts without asking her permission, which should have annoyed her and somehow hadn't. What did you hear? That you married me for the water rights. He looked at her for a beat. Then he said, Do you believe that? No, she said without hesitation, and that surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. But I thought you should know what they're saying. He was quiet for a moment. Let them say it. It doesn't bother you. I've had worse things said about me, he said, and most of them were true. He said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, and then looked back down at the ledger. This March balance is wrong. Someone overcharged you on seed stock. She blinked. I know. I didn't have leverage to argue it at the time. You do now. He made a note in the margin. I'll go into town tomorrow and sort it. She sat very still for a moment, watching him bent over her ledger with a pencil and a focused expression, fixing the things that had been wrong before he arrived. She didn't know what to do with that. She didn't know what to do with any of this, with the man who had entered her life like a clause in a contract and was slowly making himself impossible to categorize. Jonah, she said. What did you mean when you said most of what they've said about you was true? He didn't answer right away. He finished the notation, set the pencil down, and sat back. When he looked at her, something in his expression had changed, not open, not confessional, but less armored than usual, like a man deciding how far back to let someone stand. Before I came to Silver Ridge, he said, I made some choices I wouldn't make now. The kind of choices that follow you. He paused. I'm not that man anymore. But I understand why people who knew that man don't believe me. She held his gaze. What changed you? The silence that followed that question lasted long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said quietly, watching someone else make the same mistakes, and not being able to stop it. She didn't push him. Whatever door he'd opened there, she could feel that it was barely cracked, and that pressing it would close it entirely. She nodded, and she looked away, and she let him return to the ledger. But she turned the words over in her mind for the rest of the night. Someone else. The same mistakes. She thought about Daniel. She thought about that letter. She was beginning to understand that everything in Silver Ridge was connected, and that the connection ran straight through the man at the end of her hallway. It was Pastor Greer who pulled her aside after Sunday service 3.5 weeks into the marriage and said the thing no one else had been direct enough to say to her face. He took her arm gently, led her a few steps from the church door, and said in the quiet tone of a man who believes he is helping, Eliza, some of the congregation have raised concerns about the speed of things, about appearances. She looked at him. What concerns specifically? That it doesn't look like a grieving widow ought to look. He said it gently. He always said hard things gently. You understand, I'm sure that people loved Daniel, and they want to see his memory honored in a way that I honored that man's memory for 11 years, she said. I cooked his meals and mended his clothes and stood beside him at every event this town ever threw, and I kept the ranch running while he was doing the work this town asked him to do. And now he is gone, and I had no choice in what came next, and you are telling me I don't look sufficiently sad. Greer opened his mouth. Don't, she said, not unkindly, but firmly. Don't tell me what grief is supposed to look like. You don't know what mine looks like because you haven't been watching close enough. She walked away. She kept her head up and her stride even all the way to the wagon. Jonah was already in the seat waiting. She climbed up beside him and he picked up the reins, and they were moving before she'd fully settled. After a moment he said, Greer. Yes. What did he want? To inform me that my grief isn't visible enough to satisfy people. Jonah said nothing to that. He drove in silence for half a mile. Then he said, he say anything about me? Not directly, but indirectly. The concern, she said, is about appearances. He made a short sound, not quite a laugh, not quite contempt. Something in between. The concern, he said, is that they don't control you anymore. She turned to look at him. What do you mean? You married a man who doesn't belong to Silver Ridge. I don't owe them anything. I don't need their approval or their business or their goodwill. He kept his eyes on the road. That makes you harder to manage, and people who've been managing you your whole life don't like that. She stared at his profile for a long moment. That's a remarkably clear-eyed way to see it. I've spent 6 years watching Silver Ridge from 12 miles out, he said. You get a different view from outside. She thought about that for the rest of the drive home. She thought about what it meant to be managed, about how much of her life she had spent inside that management without ever calling it what it was. Daniel had been part of it, not cruelly, she didn't think, but he had belonged to Silver Ridge in a way that meant she did too through him, on the town's terms and no one else's. Now she was married to a man who didn't belong to anyone. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a kind of freedom or a kind of danger. Maybe it was both. The answer came 2 days later, and it came in the form of Deputy Cal Brewster, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, and an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who has been sent to do something he doesn't entirely agree with. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you." "What is it, Cal?" He glanced past her into the house, checking for Jonah. She realized, which told her immediately that this was about Jonah. "There's been a question raised," he said carefully. "About Mr. Hale, his past, before he came here." He paused. "The council asked me to look into something." She kept her face neutral. "What kind of something?" "His connection to some men down south, out of Laredo." Brewster hesitated. "There are people saying he didn't just know those men, Mrs. Hale, that he worked with them, back before he came north." The word "worked" was doing a great deal of lifting in that sentence. She understood what he meant. "And the council sent you here to tell me this," she said. "They thought you should know." She looked at Brewster, a decent man. She'd always thought a man who followed orders because he believed in the people giving them, and who was currently beginning to understand that the people giving them weren't always worth that belief. She could see it in his face. He didn't look certain. He looked like a man who'd been told to deliver a message and had only now, standing here, started to wonder who really wrote it. "Cal," she said, "who raised the question specifically?" He shifted his weight. "It came through the council. Reardon." The half-second pause before his denial told her everything. "I can't say, Mrs. Hale." "No," she said. "I imagine you can't." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you for coming out. I'll take it under advisement." After he rode away, she closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hand flat on the wood, and she thought about the letter in her drawer. She thought about what Jonah had said, "I made choices I wouldn't make now. The kind that follow you." She thought about Laredo, about men down south, about a quiet rancher who had shown up at a council meeting and offered to marry a widow no one else wanted to help. She needed the truth. She needed it now, not in pieces, not in carefully measured half-answers doled out when he decided she could handle them. She needed to look him in the face and ask him directly, and trust herself to read what she found. She heard him come in from the yard. She turned around. And when he saw her face, he stopped in the doorway. He read her the way she was learning to read him, quickly, precisely, with almost no room for error. "What happened?" he said. "I think," she said, "that we need to have an honest conversation. Tonight. All of it." He looked at her for a long moment. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't deflect or reframe or buy time with a question. He said, "All right." And in that single quiet word, she heard something she hadn't expected. Not reluctance. Not calculation. Something that sounded unmistakably like relief. He sat down at the kitchen table without being asked. That was the first thing she noticed. He didn't pace, didn't stand with his back to her, didn't put furniture between them, the way people do when they're preparing to manage a conversation rather than have one. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and put both hands flat on the table in front of him. Open. Visible. Like a man setting down everything he'd been carrying and letting her see the weight of it. Eliza set the letter on the table between them. She watched his face when he saw it. He didn't flinch, didn't go pale, didn't do any of the things a guilty man does when evidence appears. What he did was close his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and looked at her. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Bottom drawer, false panel." She sat down across from him. "I found it 2 weeks ago." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass to it. He looked at the letter, then at her, and she could see him making a decision, not calculating, not strategizing, but genuinely deciding, choosing. "How much do you want to know?" he said. "Everything," she said, "starting with how you knew my husband." He breathed in slowly through his nose. "I didn't know Daniel personally, but I knew what he was investigating." He paused. 3 years ago, I was working land down near the Pecos River. Hired work, nothing I'm proud of. Some of it things I told you I wouldn't do now. The man who hired me was running a land scheme. Buying up water rights through intimidation, forged documents, sometimes worse. He stopped. When men wouldn't sell, things happened to them. She kept her voice level. "What kind of things?" "Accidents," he said. "The kind that aren't." The word landed in the room and stayed there. She didn't look away from him. "I left when I understood what I was part of," he said. "That's the truth. It took me too long to understand it, and I'm not asking you to forgive me for that. But I left, and I came north, and I tried to put as much distance between myself and those men as geography would allow." He looked down at his hands on the table. "What I didn't know when I came to Silver Ridge was that the operation had already moved north, that the man running it, Reardon, had been quietly working this territory for 2 years before I arrived." Eliza felt the floor of the conversation shift. "Reardon runs the operation. He's the face of it," Jonah said. "The money comes from somewhere else. But Reardon's the one on the ground, and when Daniel started pulling at the threads looking into the land transfers, the deeds that didn't add up, Reardon needed him to stop." She looked at the letter. She thought about the date on it. 6 weeks before Daniel died. "They killed him," she said. Jonah held her gaze and didn't soften it. "I believe so. Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the wind against the house, and nothing else for a long moment. She had known, she realized now she had known since the night she found the letter, that this was where it was going. She had known it the way you know, a tooth is going to have to come out before the dentist says so. The knowledge had been living in her chest for 2 weeks, and hearing it said aloud was both worse and easier than she'd expected. "The council," she said. "Briggs. Are they part of it? Some of them know more than they're admitting, whether they're complicit or just afraid." He shook his head. "I don't know where that line is yet." "Yet," she repeated. "You're still looking into it?" "Yes." She sat very still. "Is that why you married me, to stay close to the investigation?" He met that question straight on. "Partly." The honesty of it hit her harder than a deflection would have. She'd expected him to deny it. She'd prepared herself to argue against a denial. Instead, he'd handed her the truth without dressing it up, and she didn't know immediately what to do with that. "Partly," she said. "I also meant what I said in that room. About the men who would come for this land. That wasn't a strategy. That was real." He paused. "Both things can be true." She stood up. Not in anger, she needed to move, needed to put the weight somewhere else while she thought. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him and her arms crossed, and she thought about Daniel. About 11 years. About a man who had kept secrets from her, and about whether he'd done it to protect her or to protect himself, and about how she'd never know the answer to that now. She thought about the man sitting at her table, who had also kept things from her, but who, when she'd asked him directly, had told her. All of it. In one sitting. Without waiting for her to break him down piece by piece. She turned around. "What do you need from me?" He blinked. Just slightly, like that wasn't the question he'd expected. "What?" "To finish what Daniel started. What do you need from me to do it?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not angry." "I'm furious," she said plainly. "I've been furious since the night I found that letter, but being furious doesn't change what needs to happen next, and I am not a woman who stops moving because she's angry." She held his gaze. "What do you need?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her. She thought the way you study terrain before you commit to crossing it. Then he said, "The ledgers. Daniel's other papers. Whatever else he collected before they stopped him. I'll go through everything again. All of it. She paused. Together. He nodded. Together. And that was the moment, not dramatic, not lit by anything, just two people at a kitchen table with a dead man's letter between them, that something in the architecture of their arrangement changed. She felt it. She thought he did too, though neither of them said so. They worked through the papers over the following 4 nights. She brought everything out of Daniel's desk. Every letter, every receipt, every scrap of paper she'd dismissed as irrelevant on first pass, and spread it across the kitchen table, and they went through it systematically, her reading aloud, while he noted and organized, both of them building the picture that Daniel had died building. It was slow work. It was also the most honest thing she had done in years, which made her feel 2 things simultaneously, a clarity that was almost like relief, and a guilt she couldn't entirely account for. On the second night, Jonah found a series of transfer documents buried inside a folded survey map. "These are the water rights," he said. He set them flat on the table and traced the signatures with one finger. "These 3 parcels transferred inside of 18 months, all to different names, but watch." He pointed. Same notary, same pen pressure, same date despite different filing marks. She leaned over his shoulder to look. "Forged." "Forged," he confirmed. And if Daniel had filed these as evidence, Reardon would have had him discredited before he got to the courthouse, she said. "Without a second set of documents to cross-reference, there's nothing here that a good lawyer couldn't explain away." She straightened up. "We need the originals." "They'd be in the county records office," he said. "Or they were before someone made sure they weren't." She looked at him. "You think they're gone?" "I think we need to verify that before we assume anything." He sat back. "I know someone who might help. Former colleague of mine turned straight work surveying now out of Abilene. He can read land records like most men read newspaper headlines. If there's something wrong in the county record, he'll find it." "You trust him?" Jonah was quiet for a beat. "I trust him to do the job. He's got his own reasons to want Reardon's kind out of the territory." She nodded. "Write to him." He looked at her. "Just like that. You said you trust him. I trust your judgment." She met his eyes. "Don't make me regret that." Something moved across his face, quick, contained, but real. Not gratitude exactly. Something quieter and less comfortable than gratitude. Like a man who hadn't expected to be trusted and didn't yet know what to do with the feeling. "I won't," he said. Tom Reardon came back on a Thursday. This time, he didn't bother with a smile. He came alone, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign that he wanted the conversation to stay private. And Eliza was in the yard when he rode up, and she stood her ground the same as the first time, because she had made a decision about Tom Reardon, which was that she would not move an inch for him, not once, not ever. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said. No preamble, no hat tip this time. "About land records, water rights." "I've been reviewing my late husband's papers," she said. "That's not asking questions, that's managing my estate." "Your estate," he repeated. "Mrs. Hale, I want to be plain with you. The offer I made was generous. It won't stay generous. Offers that stop being generous when someone says no weren't generous to begin with," she said. "They were just pressure." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Some calculation revised itself. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he underestimated. It wasn't flattering, and it wasn't respectful. It was the particular look of someone recategorizing a problem. "Where's your husband?" he said. "Working." "I'd like to speak to him." "He's not available." Reardon held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, and this was the part that stayed with her, the part she turned over in her mind for days after. "You should ask him about Webb Calloway, Mrs. Hale. Ask him what happened in Laredo. Ask him what kind of man you invited into your home." He paused. and then decide if his word is worth what you're risking." He left without waiting for her response. She stood in the yard after his horse disappeared, and she felt the cold of it settle into her. Not fear, not yet, but the particular chill of knowing that a man like Reardon doesn't give warnings. He gives previews. She went inside. Jonah was at the desk. He looked up when he heard her face. "Reardon was here," she said. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "Are you?" "I'm fine." He was alone. He didn't threaten me directly. She looked at him. "He told me to ask you about Webb Calloway." The change in Jonah's face was immediate and complete. Every line of it went different in a single second. Not guilty, not evasive, but something she hadn't seen on him before. Something that looked underneath the control like pain. "Sit down," he said. "I'm standing." "Eliza." He said her name. Her first name the way she'd said his that morning at breakfast when she'd asked about Reardon. First names between them still meant something. "Please, sit down." She sat. He stood with his back to the wall and his arms at his sides, and he told her about Webb Calloway. Webb had been 23, young enough to be stupid old enough to know better, and he had been hired by the same operation Jonah had worked for down in Laredo. Hired after Jonah brought in when the operation needed someone willing to do the things Jonah had refused. Jonah had known what Calloway was being used for. He had known, and he had told himself it wasn't his problem, that he was already pulling back, that the best thing he could do was leave and not look behind him. He had left. And 3 weeks after he left, Webb Calloway had been killed not by Reardon's men, but by the people Reardon's men had been terrorizing who had finally had enough. Killed because of orders that Jonah might have been able to stop if he'd spoken up sooner, if he'd moved faster, if he'd made a different choice when it still mattered. "He wasn't a good man," Jonah said. His voice was flat and careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed control over this particular thing for a long time. "He made his own choices, but he was young and he was used, and I could have—" He stopped. "I think about it." The room was very still. "Is that what you meant?" she said slowly. "When you said you watched someone make the same mistakes and couldn't stop it?" He looked at her. "Yes." She understood then fully at last what drove Jonah Hale. Not guilt exactly, though it lived in him. Not atonement, though he was trying. It was simpler and heavier than either of those things. It was the specific grinding weight of a man who had looked away at the wrong moment, and who had decided that he would never look away again. She thought about Daniel, who had looked straight at it, who had done exactly what Jonah hadn't done in Laredo, and had died for it. She thought about what it cost a person to be the one who does the right thing. "Reardon told you that story," she said, "to make you doubt me. I know. He thinks if you lose faith in me, you'll be easier to manage, or you'll leave." Jonah held her gaze. "I know that too. So he doesn't have anything real." She said it half to herself, working it out. "He's using your past because he hasn't got leverage over our present. He's frightened." She looked up. "That means we're close to something." The expression that crossed Jonah's face at that was complicated admiration, wasn't quite the right word, and neither was surprise, but it was somewhere in that territory. Like a man watching someone do something he didn't expect them to do as well as they were doing it. "There's something else," he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, the letter he'd written to his contact in Abilene. "I was going to send this tomorrow, but after today—" He set it on the table. "I think it needs to go tonight." She picked it up, read it. It was precise and clear, and it asked for exactly the right things. She set it back down. "I'll ride into town first thing," she said. "I'll go." "No." She met his eyes. "If you go, it looks like a man conducting business. If I go, it looks like a widow running errands. We are less visible when I'm the one moving." She paused. "Reardon's watching you. He's not watching me as carefully. That's an advantage, and I intend to use it." Jonah stared at her for a moment. Then quietly, so quietly, she almost missed it, he said, "Daniel was a fool." She blinked. "What?" "To not tell you." He said it without cruelty, without sentiment, just as a plain observation. If he'd trusted you with this from the beginning, he might still be alive. The words hit her somewhere she hadn't been prepared to be hit. She sat with them for a moment, not quite able to look at him, not quite able to look away. "You don't know that," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But I know he kept you outside of it because he thought he was protecting you. And all it did was leave you alone with the consequences." She looked down at her hands. She thought about Daniel and about the years of not knowing and about the particular exhaustion of being someone's protected thing rather than their partner. She had loved him. She had. But Jonah had just named something she hadn't had words for, something she'd been carrying without being able to say what it was. "He thought I couldn't handle it," she said. He was wrong. 3 words, plain, unadorned, and the most direct thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could remember. She felt something in her chest shift, not dramatically, not the way people in stories describe feelings shifting, but the way a door that's been stuck for a long time finally gives. Quietly, without fanfare, just suddenly, less resistance than before. She stood up, picked up the letter, and said, "I'll be back before noon tomorrow." He nodded. Then he said, "Be careful. Not be safe. Not let me know, not any of the managed distance things he might have said a month ago. Just be careful." Like he meant it. Like it was a real thing he was saying to a real person he didn't want to lose. She tucked the letter into her coat and went to bed. But she lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling, and the thing she kept returning to wasn't Daniel, and it wasn't Reardon, and it wasn't the land or the water rights or the forged documents. It was the sound of Jonah Hale's voice when he said her name, and the fact that she had stopped sometime in the last week being afraid of what that meant. She was 3 miles from town the next morning when she found the road blocked. 2 men on horseback side by side in the middle of the trail. She didn't recognize them, but she recognized the posture, casual, unhurried, the kind of positioned casual that is precisely the opposite of accidental. She stopped her horse. The one on the left said, "Morning, Mrs. Hale. Nice day for a ride." "It was," she said. "Mr. Reardon thought you might be heading into town. Asked us to pass along a message." She kept her hands on the reins and her voice on flat ground. "What message?" "He said to tell you the offer closes at end of week, and to remind you that accidents happen to people who go looking for trouble." The man paused. "He said you'd understand." She looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was going fast, and she kept that entirely to herself. "Tell Mr. Reardon," she said, "that I received his message." She turned her horse around and rode back the way she'd come. Not fast enough to look frightened. Steady, controlled. The same speed she'd left at. She kept that pace for exactly half a mile. Then she pushed the horse to a run. She heard him before she reached the barn. Jonah was at the fence line closest to the house, and when he heard the horse coming in hard, he dropped what he was holding and moved, not running, but moving with the particular urgency of a man who has trained himself not to run, because running means panic, and panic costs you time you don't have. He reached her as she pulled up. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a demand. She swung down from the saddle. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. "2 of Reardon's men on the road. They stopped me. Said the offer closes end of week." She paused. "And that accidents happen to people who go looking for trouble." Jonah's face went very still in the way that was she had learned more serious than anger. Anger moved across him and passed. This stillness was something else. The particular stillness of a man running calculations behind his eyes, fast and cold and without sentiment. "Did they touch you?" "No." "Did they follow you back?" "I don't think so. I watched the road." He looked past her anyway, scanning the trail. Then he looked back at her. You're all right. I'm all right, she confirmed. And then, because it was true, and because she was done pretending otherwise, and I'm angry. Good, he said. Stay angry. It'll be more useful than afraid. She handed him the reins and walked inside, and she went straight to the kitchen table and stood there with her palms flat on the wood and thought hard and fast. Reardon had escalated because they were moving. He wouldn't have moved his men onto that road if he'd felt secure. The block was a warning, yes, but warnings were also a form of confession. You only warn people who are close enough to the thing you're protecting to be dangerous. Jonah came in behind her. The letter still needs to go, he said. I know. I'll take it, tonight, different road. She looked up. They'll be watching you. They're already watching me, but they can't watch every road in the dark. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down leaning forward with his elbows on the table. There's something else I should have told you sooner. My contact Marcus Webb, the surveyor in Ablaze, he already wrote back. She stared at him. When? 3 days ago, I was still deciding how much to tell you. The sentence landed between them like something dropped. She felt the familiar heat of it, the reflexive anger of a woman who has been protected past the point of usefulness, and she made herself wait one breath before she spoke. Don't do that again, she said. Don't decide how much I can handle. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. He held her gaze and didn't flinch. You're right. I'm sorry. Simple. No elaboration, no justification. Just the admission clean and straight. She breathed out. What did he say? Jonah reached into his jacket and set a folded letter on the table between them. The county records office in Silver Ridge filed a deed transfer 6 months before Daniel died. 300 acres on the North Creek boundary listed as a voluntary sale from a rancher named Aldous Freer to a holding company called Meridian Land Partners. He paused. Aldous Freer died 8 months before that transfer was filed. The room went quiet. A dead man sold his land, Eliza said. A dead man's forged signature sold his land, Jonah said. Marcus pulled the probate records. Freer had no heirs and no will. His estate should have gone to county administration. Instead, Meridian Land Partners has held it for over a year without a single challenge because no one in Silver Ridge knew to look. And Meridian Land Partners is owned by a holding structure that Marcus traced through 4 shell companies to a private investor in Fort Worth. He looked at her, whose lawyer as of 2 years ago was a man named Gerald Briggs. She sat back in her chair. Briggs, the head of the Silver Ridge Town Council, the man who had organized Daniel's funeral, the man who had sat across from her in that room and told her she was going to be married again and framed it as protection. That's why Daniel couldn't go to the council, she said slowly. He'd already figured out Briggs was involved. He had no one to report to. He had the territorial marshal's office, Jonah said. And Marcus thinks that's exactly where he was headed when Reardon moved. She thought about the letter in the false panel. You cannot keep this up. We have been patient. 6 weeks before Daniel died. He had been planning something. He'd been building toward it, and they had stopped him before he got there. We need to get to the marshal's office, she said. Yes. Not a letter. Someone has to go in person. She looked at him. Can Marcus meet us somewhere neutral ground? Jonah nodded slowly. He suggested Clearwater. It's 30 miles east away from Reardon's territory. He can be there in 2 days if I send word tonight. Then send it. She stood up. And we go tomorrow. He looked at her for a moment, that look she was becoming familiar with, the recalibration look, the one that meant she had once again done something he hadn't predicted. We'll need to move early, before town is watching the roads. I know how to move early, she said. I've been doing it my whole life. They left before 4 in the morning. No lanterns. No noise beyond what the horses couldn't help making. She had packed what they'd need in a saddlebag the night before: the forged transfer documents, Daniel's letter, the notes she and Jonah had compiled across 4 evenings at the kitchen table. Everything that could be carried, carried. Everything that couldn't left hidden in the bottom of Daniel's old trunk, under the floorboard, that she had found at 11 years old, was the best hiding place in the ranch. They rode in silence for the first hour. The dark was total, and the cold was. She was grateful for both less chance of being seen, and the cold kept her mind sharp in a way that warmth didn't. At the first gray edge of dawn, she said, "Did Daniel know about you specifically?" Jonah rode for a moment before answering. "I think he may have heard my name in connection with the Laredo operation. I don't know what he made of it. So when the council chose you, either Briggs didn't know my history well enough to see me as a threat, or Reardon underestimated what I'd do once I was on this land." He paused. "I think it was the second one. He thought I was a man who could be bought twice." "Because you were once." "Yes." She considered that, the honesty of it, the way he never dressed it up. "What made you come to that council meeting?" she said. "The real reason, not the protective reason. The first reason, the one that made you decide before you even knew what they'd ask." The sky was lightening at the edges, and she could see his profile now, the line of his jaw, the way he was looking at the road ahead with that focused, forward-pointing attention that was just how he moved through the world. "I'd been watching this land for a year," he said, "since I figured out Reardon was moving into the territory, and I knew Daniel Cross was the only law between Reardon and everything north of the creek line." He stopped. "When Daniel died, I understood what was going to happen next, and I understood that I'd spent a year watching from 12 miles out and doing nothing, and I wasn't going to do that again." He said the last sentence with a particular flatness that told her exactly what it was. Not a speech, not a justification, but a man saying the true thing as directly as he knew how. "So I wasn't the reason," she said. "Not at the beginning." "No," he said. "You weren't the reason at the beginning." The "at the beginning" was doing real work in that sentence, and both of them knew it. She didn't pull on it. She let it stand. Marcus Webb was already at the Clearwater way station when they arrived. He was a compact, quiet man in his 50s, with the kind of face that had spent too much time in open country and wore it like a record of everywhere he'd been. He shook Jonah's hand without excess and looked at Eliza with a directness that was not unfriendly. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you," she said. "Tell me what you found." He liked that. She could tell from the small shift in his expression, the slight relaxing of a man who had expected to be eased into the conversation, and was relieved to skip that part. They sat at the single table in the way station's main room, and Marcus laid out what he'd compiled with the precision of a man who had built his second life on exactness. The deed transfer for Aldous Freer's land was the cornerstone, but it wasn't alone. There were 2 other transfers in the county record that showed the same pattern, dated signatures from men Marcus had confirmed were deceased or out of the territory at the time of filing. All flowing into Meridian Land Partners. All notarized by the same hand. "The notary," Eliza said. "Who is he?" "Was," Marcus said. "He died in December. Heart failure, they said." He said they said in the tone of a man who had learned to be skeptical of convenient causes of death. "But before he died, he kept a private record. I found it through his wife, who was more than happy to share it, once I explained what it might mean for the land her family lost 12 years ago." He set a slim water-stained journal on the table. Eliza picked it up, opened it. The handwriting inside was small and careful, and deeply frightened she could feel the fear in it, in the cramped letters in the marginal notations that kept circling back to the same names, as if the man who wrote them was still trying to convince himself of what he was seeing. Reardon, Briggs, and one more name she hadn't encountered before. "Who is Harlan Cross?" she said. The silence that followed was 3 seconds too long. She looked up. Marcus was looking at the journal. Jonah was looking at her. "Jonah," she said. "Eliza, who is Harlan Cross?" Jonah set his hands flat on the table, The same gesture he'd used the night he'd told her everything at the kitchen table. She registered the same deliberate openness. "Harlan Cross is Daniel's brother," he said. "Older brother. He left Silver Ridge 15 years ago. No one in town talks about him." She stared at him. "I know Daniel had a brother. They didn't speak. Daniel told me there was a falling out over—" She stopped. Her mouth went dry. "Over land." "Over their father's land," Jonah said. "Which Harlan believed Daniel had arranged to inherit unfairly. Which is—" He paused. "Which is how Reardon got to him. Harlan had a grievance, and Reardon had money, and the two of those things together are very useful if you need someone with a local family name to front a land operation." The room was very still. "Harlan Cross is the investor," she said, "behind Meridian Land Partners." "We believe so," Marcus said quietly. "The Fort Worth lawyer connected to the holding company has handled Harlan Cross's personal legal affairs for over a decade." She set the journal down carefully. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. She thought about Daniel. About a man who had spent 11 years as the law in Silver Ridge while his own brother was building a criminal operation in the ground beneath him. About whether Daniel had known. About whether that was what had broken him in that last year, not just the evidence he was gathering, but the understanding of who was ultimately behind it. "Daniel knew," she said. Not a question. Jonah's voice was careful. "I think he found out toward the end. I think that's why he was moving as fast as he was. He knew that once it came out it would destroy everything he'd built here, his name, his record, everything." He paused. He wasn't just trying to stop a crime. He was trying to stop it before it became his family name on the warrant. She was quiet for a long time. Marcus didn't fill the silence, and she was grateful to him for it. Finally, she said, "So Harlan had Daniel killed to stop the investigation. And Reardon carried it out," Jonah said. "And Briggs made sure the council stayed quiet, and the widow got managed. By marrying her off to a man they thought would keep her occupied and out of the way," she said. "Yes." She looked at Jonah directly. "And instead, they accidentally put me in a house with the one person in Silver Ridge who already knew most of the truth." Something moved across Jonah's face, quiet, unguarded, and gone quickly, but she caught it. "That's one way to say it," he said. "Is there a better way?" He held her gaze for a moment. "I don't think I'm the right person to put it another way," he said, and the restraint in those words was careful and deliberate, and she understood what was underneath it, with a clarity that made her look back down at the journal. "What do we do with this?" she said to Marcus. "The Territorial Marshal's Office in Abilene has a standing investigation into land fraud across 3 counties," Marcus said. "What we have here is the evidentiary thread they've been missing. The notary's journal alone is enough to open a formal case. Combined with the transfer documents and your husband's notes—" He spread his hands. "This doesn't disappear, Mrs. Hale. Not anymore." "How long?" she said. "If we take this to Abilene today, how long before something happens?" "Weeks. Maybe less, if the marshal moves fast." He paused. "But Reardon will know something's in motion the moment you ride out of Silver Ridge with a saddlebag. He's going to push before the end of the week regardless. You said his offer closed Friday." "Yes." "Then you have 3 days to get ahead of this." She looked at Jonah. He looked at her. Between them, without either of them saying it, the same calculation was running what Reardon would do, when he'd do it, what they had, and what they still needed. "If we ride hard," she said, "we can reach Abilene by tomorrow evening." "I'll ride with you to the county line," Marcus said, "in case his men are on the roads." "They will be," Jonah said. He said it with certainty, the kind of certainty that came from knowing how men like Reardon thought, because he had once thought that way himself. They left within the hour. They were 4 miles from the Silver Ridge County line when Jonah pulled up his horse. Eliza stopped beside him. "What?" "Listen," he said. She listened. Hoofbeats, more than 2 horses, coming from the east from the direction of the Silver Ridge Road, moving fast and not trying to hide it. Marcus said very quietly, "They know." Jonah turned to Eliza. His voice was low and absolutely level. "Take the creek trail north. 2 miles up there's a fork, go right. It comes out above the Caldwell property. Keep moving and don't stop whatever you hear behind you." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "Slow them down." "Jonah." "Eliza." He said her name the way he had the night he'd told her about Webb Calloway, with a weight to it, like he was putting something real behind it. "I am not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to take what we've built for the last 6 weeks and get it to safety. Because if that saddlebag doesn't reach Abilene, none of this mattered." She held his gaze for a single long second. She thought about the man who had walked into that council room and sat down opposite her and been the first person in a very long time to tell her the truth, because she asked for it. She thought about the ledger corrections, the water rights, the nights at the kitchen table. The careful way he'd said, "Daniel was a fool not to trust you." "You come back," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a plea. It was a statement of what she required. "I intend to," he said. She held his eyes 1 beat longer. Then she took the reins, turned the horse north, and rode. Bern. She heard the hoofbeats converge behind her, and she didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward, and her horse moving, and she counted the beats of the trail, the way she'd learned to count everything systematically, without panic, one thing after the next. The creek trail was narrow, and she knew it. She'd ridden it as a girl before Daniel, before everything. She knew where the ground went soft, and where to hug the tree line, and where to push the pace, and where pulling back would save the horse's legs for what came after. Marcus rode hard beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. 2 miles. The fork. Right. She took it without slowing. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, she heard a single shout. Then nothing. She pushed harder. The Caldwell property came up on her left, the low fence line the familiar shape of the windmill, and she knew then that she was through the worst of it, that Reardon's men would have had to make a choice back at the fork, that she had enough lead now to matter. She slowed just enough to let the horse breathe, just enough to let herself think. Jonah was still back there. She shut that thought down. She couldn't afford it. Not yet. "How far to the county line?" she asked Marcus. "Another mile?" he said. "Then you're out of Reardon's territory and into county jurisdiction. His men won't cross it openly." "Openly," she said. "Nothing about this man has been open," Marcus said. "But he's careful. Careful men don't create witnesses unnecessarily." She thought about that, about whether careful men made exceptions for women who were carrying enough evidence to end everything they'd built. She thought about Jonah alone on a road behind her. 1 mile. She rode it. Solme. At the county line marker, she stopped. She turned the horse and looked back the way she'd come. The road was empty. The morning had opened up into full light, and the land around her was still and quiet in the way that could mean anything. Marcus pulled up beside her. He read her face. He didn't say anything encouraging, because he was not that kind of man, and she was grateful. 3 minutes passed. Then she heard a single horse, coming fast. She didn't move. Her heart was very loud. Jonah came over the rise at a hard canter alone, and when he reached her and pulled up, she looked him over with the rapid assessing eye of someone checking damage, checking his face, his hands, the line of his shoulders. "You're all right," she said. "They were Reardon's men," he said, "but they weren't expecting 2 of us to hold the road, and they didn't want witnesses any more than we wanted a fight. They pulled back when they understood what they'd have to do to get past us." He looked at her steadily. "We have maybe 6 hours before Reardon recalculates and sends someone who doesn't care about witnesses. Then we ride," she said. They rode, and somewhere in the middle of that long, hard stretch toward Abilene, with the evidence in her saddlebag and the road opening ahead of her, Eliza Cross. Eliza Hale understood something she had been slowly understanding for weeks, but had not yet put into plain words. She was not running away from Silver Ridge. She was riding back toward it. toward the ranch, toward the truth, toward the reckoning that Daniel had died trying to start. And she was not doing it alone, and she had not been doing it alone for a long time now. And the man riding beside her was not a contract or a convenience or a transaction. She did not say any of this out loud. But she looked across at him, the line of his jaw, his eyes on the road, his hands easy on the reins, and something in her that had been clenched since the morning she stood at Daniel's grave finally quietly let go. She looked back at the road. She rode faster. They reached Abilene as the last light was leaving the sky. The marshal's office was a square, no-nonsense building at the end of the main street, and the man behind the desk, Marshal Cole Hatcher, 50-something, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by human behavior. Sometime around 1871, looked up when they walked in and read the room in about 4 seconds. He looked at Eliza. He looked at Jonah. He looked at the saddlebag she set on his desk. "I'm listening," he said. She talked for 40 minutes. She laid it out the way she'd learned to do everything in the last 6 weeks systematically without sentiment in the order that made the most logical sense. She put the documents on the desk as she referenced them. The forged transfers. Daniel's letter. The notary's journal. Marcus Webb's surveying analysis. She watched Hatcher's expression move through careful attention into something sharper and more focused as the picture assembled itself in front of him. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the stack of evidence on his desk for a long moment. "Your husband put a good portion of this together himself," he said. "He did," she said. "He just didn't get far enough." Hatcher looked at Jonah. "And you worked the Laredo operation." "Years ago," Jonah said, "before I understood what I was part of." "But you understand it now." "Yes." "And you're willing to testify." "Yes." Hatcher nodded slowly. He picked up the notary's journal and turned it in his hands. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "what you've brought me tonight is more than I've been able to build in 8 months of trying. I have 2 deputies who've been looking at Reardon from the outside for the better part of a year." He set the journal down. "I can have warrants drawn by morning." Eliza felt the breath leave her. Not with relief, not yet, but with the particular release of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down somewhere that can hold the weight of it. "Reardon knows we left Silver Ridge," she said. "He'll move fast. The offer on the property was supposed to close Friday." "It's Wednesday night," Hatcher said. He stood up. "Then we move faster." They didn't sleep. Hatcher's 2 deputies, both younger than Eliza had expected, both with the serious, methodical manner of men who had chosen this work because they believed in it, sat with her and Jonah at a table in the back room of the marshal's office and went through everything again. Every document examined twice, every name, cross-referenced every piece of timeline, nailed down against the notary's journal dates. Marcus Webb sat in the corner making notes with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent his career making the complicated legible. Jonah sat beside her through all of it. At some point, somewhere around 2 in the morning, his hand came to rest on the table close enough to hers that their fingers were almost touching. She didn't move her hand away. Neither did he. At 3 o'clock, Hatcher came back with the warrants. "Reardon," he said. "Briggs, Harlan Cross." He laid them out one at a time. "And 2 of Reardon's men whose names the journal identified as involved in the deed signings." He looked at Eliza. "I'm sending a rider to Silver Ridge tonight. My men will be there before dawn." "What about us?" she said. "You go home," he said. "Let the law do what the law is supposed to do." He paused. "Your husband started this. You finished it. That's enough." She looked at the warrants on the table. She thought about Daniel, about what it had cost him to get this far, about the letter in the false panel, about a man who had faced something enormous and faced it alone because he hadn't known how to ask for help. She thought about what it would mean for his name, whether the story that survived would be the story of a sheriff who died before he could finish, or the story of a sheriff who laid the groundwork that ultimately brought the whole operation down. She knew which story she was going to make sure got told. "I want to be there," she said. When they take Reardon." Hatcher looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Hale, I am not asking to carry a badge," she said. "I'm asking to stand on my own land when the man who murdered my husband is taken off it. That is not an unreasonable thing to want." Hatcher looked at Jonah. "She goes where she decides to go," Jonah said simply. "That's not my call, and it's not yours." Hatcher was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll stay back, out of the way." "Agreed," she said. They rode back toward Silver Ridge in the dark with Hatcher and 4 deputies, and the ride was long and cold, and nobody talked much, which was fine. Eliza rode beside Jonah, and she thought about the ranch, about the horses in the barn, about the kitchen table covered in papers they'd worked through night after night, about the room at the end of the hall where a man had kept his word from the first day without once making her feel the weight of it. An hour from Silver Ridge, she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "When this is over." He glanced at her. When this is over, what? She had thought about how to say this. She had been thinking about it since the county line, since the moment she'd watched him come over that rise on his horse, and felt something in her chest go loose with relief. She had thought about elegant ways to say it, and she had thought about careful ways to say it, and she had ultimately decided that what Jonah Hale deserved more than anything was the plain thing said plainly. "When this is over," she said, "I'd like to know what we are. Not what the contract says. Not what Silver Ridge thinks. What we actually are." He rode for a moment. She watched his profile in the dark. "I know what I am," he said. "I've known for a while. Then tell me." He looked at her. And in the dark on that road without anything to perform for, and no one watching his face was different than she had ever seen it, not open exactly, not soft, but unguarded in a way that was its own kind of language. "I'm a man who would ride any road you need riding," he said. "Who would stand between you and any threat that comes, not because anyone asked me to, not because of any arrangement, but because the thought of something happening to you is the one thing I cannot make myself accept." He paused. "That's what I am. If that's something you want, it's yours. If it isn't, I'll respect that, and we'll figure out the rest." She held his gaze for a long moment. "It's something I want," she said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than it looked like. She turned back to the road, and she felt warm, despite the cold, and she kept that warmth close and said nothing else, because some things were exactly right at exactly the right size, and didn't need to be made larger. They arrived at the outskirts of Silver Ridge as the sky was beginning to lighten. Hatcher split his deputies 2 to Briggs's house in town, 1 to watch the county road south, 1 to circle behind the Reardon property, which bordered Silver Ridge land on the east side of the creek. He and 1 deputy rode for Reardon directly. Jonah and Eliza went back to the ranch. She didn't know what she expected to find when she got there. Part of her had been braced for damage, a broken fence, a fired barn, some crude demonstration of what Reardon was capable of. What she found instead was exactly what she'd left: the horses in the barn, the house standing, the cold stove waiting for a fire. She built the fire. Jonah checked the property line. When he came back in, he said, "Nothing's been touched." And she heard in his voice the same quiet surprise she felt. "He was waiting for Friday," she said. "He thought he had time." "He miscalculated," Jonah said. They sat at the kitchen table and waited. It was the hardest thing she had done in weeks. Harder than facing Reardon's men on the road, harder than the ride to Abilene, harder than laying everything out in front of Marshal Hatcher. Waiting was always harder than moving. At 7:30, they heard horses. Jonah was at the door first. She was right behind him. Deputy Ferris came up the road at a trot, and his face said everything before he opened his mouth. "Reardon's in custody," he said. "Briggs too. Took them both at first light. Reardon's men scattered. Most of them won't be far. We'll collect them by tonight." He paused. "Harlan Cross was at Reardon's place. Came in on the night train from Fort Worth yesterday evening." Eliza felt the words settle into her. Harlan Cross had come himself, which meant he'd known something was closing in, that he'd come to manage it personally, and had walked directly into the warrants waiting for him. "Is he talking?" she said. "Loudly," Ferris said. "He's blaming Reardon for everything, which won't hold up for 5 minutes once the marshal's office finishes with the journal." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Hale, I'm sorry about your husband. What he put together before it mattered. What you did with it matters more." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice quite enough to say thank you. Ferris tipped his hat and rode back toward town. She stood in the doorway, and she heard Silver Ridge going about its morning somewhere beyond the hills, heard nothing specific, just the knowledge of a town that was at this moment different than it had been yesterday. A wound being cleaned at last, painful but necessary, real. Jonah's hand came to rest on her shoulder, not claiming, not dramatic, just there, solid and certain, and asking for nothing. She put her hand over his and held it. They went into town that afternoon. She had thought carefully about it. She could have stayed on the ranch, could have let the legal machinery run without her face attached to it. But Silver Ridge had been watching her since the day Daniel died, measuring her grief, deciding what she was allowed to be. She was done letting Silver Ridge measure her. She was done standing at the edge of her own life, waiting for permission to live it. She dressed deliberately. Not the dark green dress from the wedding. Something she'd made herself blue, fitted properly, the kind of thing a woman wears when she intends to be seen. Jonah said nothing about the dress. But when she came into the kitchen, he looked at her in a way that made her stand a little straighter. They rode into town side by side. People stopped. That was the first thing. People just stopped in the street, in the doorways of shops, and looked at the two of them riding in together, with the easy parallel posture of people who have learned to occupy the same space without effort. She read their faces as she passed. Surprise, confusion. The particular unsettled expression of people whose narrative about someone has just been disrupted. Agnes Pruitt was outside the dry goods store. She looked at Eliza with an expression that tried to be neutral and didn't quite get there. "Mrs. Hale," she said. "Agnes," Eliza said pleasantly, and kept riding. At the marshal's office, Hatcher met her on the steps. "Thought you might come in," he said. He wasn't displeased. "Reardon's asked to speak to you." Jonah moved forward. Hatcher held up a hand. "He asked to speak to Mrs. Hale. Alone." "No," Jonah said. "Jonah," Eliza said. He looked at her. "I'll hear what he has to say," she said. "You'll be right outside." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back, not happily, but without argument, because he understood, she could see that he understood, that this was something she needed to do for herself. That there were things you had to face on your own terms, in your own voice, with no one else's presence between you and the weight of it. Reardon was in a locked room at the back of the building, and he didn't look like a man who had lost. That was the first thing she noticed. He still had the posture of someone who believed there was a version of this that could go his way. Men like Reardon always did. It was their defining characteristic and their most reliable weakness. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I want you to know this isn't personal." "I know it isn't," she said. She sat down across from him. "For you, it was never personal. That's the whole problem." He leaned forward. "There's still a deal to be made. The property, the water rights there, are investors behind this, who have interests that go beyond what any marshal's warrant can reach. You could walk away from this with enough money to—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. "You killed my husband," she said. "You forged a dead man's signature to steal his land. You sent men to block a road and threaten a woman riding alone." She looked at him steadily. "And you are sitting there trying to make a deal with me because the only way you know how to see people is as the price they'll accept." She stood up. "There is no price, Mr. Reardon. There is no version of this that ends the way you want it to. You should have understood that when I told you the property wasn't for sale." She walked to the door and knocked twice. "Mrs. Hale," he said behind her. One last attempt, the voice of a man watching something he built collapse and still trying to find the angle. She didn't turn around. Outside, Jonah was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the door, and when she came out, he read her face in the way he did now, quickly, precisely, with a care he didn't try to hide. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, and she meant it completely. They walked back out into the street, and the afternoon light was full, and the town of Silver Ridge was doing the awkward, necessary work of reconfiguring itself around a truth it had spent too long avoiding. She could see it in the way people moved, some avoiding her eyes, some meeting them with something that looked like relief, some still working out which direction to stand. Pastor Greer came across the street with his hat in his hands, not his Sunday authority. Hat, just his hat, held the way a man holds something he's ready to put down. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You do," she agreed. "But right now, I'm going home." He blinked. "You can bring it to the ranch," she said, not unkindly. "Anytime that suits you." She walked on. She heard Jonah make a very small sound beside her that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in that territory. "You're going to terrify this town," he said. "Good," she said. "It needed some." The formal proceedings took 3 weeks. Reardon was charged with fraud conspiracy and 2 counts of murder. Aldous Freer, whose death had never been properly investigated, and Daniel Cross, whose case was reopened and reassigned to a territorial judge who had no connections to Silver Ridge. Harlan Cross, faced with the weight of the notary's journal and his own paper trail through 4 shell companies, took a plea arrangement that put him in a territorial prison for 12 years and stripped Meridian Land Partners of every asset it held. The forged land transfers were voided. 3 families who had lost property to the scheme began the process of reclaiming it. Gerald Briggs resigned from the council on a Tuesday morning and was gone from Silver Ridge by Thursday, which the town received with the quiet, collective exhale of a community that had been holding something in for a very long time. Eliza was called to give testimony twice. She gave it clearly and completely and without embellishment, and the territorial judge thanked her for the quality of her preparation. She thanked him and went home. Through all of it, the ranch kept running. They got up before dawn, the same as always. She lit the stove and made the coffee. He came in from the barn. They ate at the same table and went through the same comfortable functional rhythms that had built themselves one day at a time, over weeks of living inside the same difficulty and finding out what the other person was made of. The difference was that nothing was being withheld now. The difference was that they talked, really talked, the way people talk when they've stopped managing each other and started trusting each other about the ranch, about the territory, about the things Jonah had seen, and the things she had thought, and the life they were without announcing it, building together out of what had been left behind by one forced decision and a great deal of hard-won honesty. She fell in love with him the way water moves into dry ground. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment, but steadily, completely, until the ground was different than it had been before, and there was no separating the two. It was a Thursday evening 6 weeks after the warrants when he found her sitting on the porch steps in the last of the light. He sat beside her without asking whether she wanted company because they were past that particular courtesy. She moved over slightly to make room, which was its own kind of language. They sat for a while without speaking. Then she said, "I found something in Daniel's desk last week." He waited. "A letter he started and didn't finish. To me." She looked down at her hands. "He wrote that he knew he'd kept me outside of too much, that he was sorry for it, that he was going to fix it once he'd dealt with—" She stopped. "He didn't get to finish it." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "Does that help?" he said, knowing he meant to. She thought about it honestly. "Some," she said. "Not all the way, but some." She looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to establish themselves. "I was angry at him for a long time. Not for dying, you can't be angry at a person for that. but for not trusting me, for deciding alone what I could and couldn't carry. She paused. I understand it better now. I understand that he was trying to love me in the only way he knew how to, but understanding it doesn't make it not lonely. No, Jonah said. It doesn't. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky the same way she had been, and his profile in the fading light was familiar to her now, in the way that things become familiar when you've looked at them honestly enough times, not just the shape of it, but what the shape meant, the steadiness behind it, the cost of it. You could have told me everything that first night, she said, when I asked you why you really agreed to the marriage. Yes, he said. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because I didn't know yet what you'd do with it, he said. And I'd spent years watching what happened when people trusted the wrong person with the wrong information. He looked at her. I needed to know who you were before I knew how much to risk. And now you know. I knew by the end of the second week, he said. I was just slower than you to say things out loud. She held his gaze. Say it now, then. He looked at her, and his face in that moment was completely unguarded, completely clear. No distance, no management, just a man looking at the one person in the world he had decided to stop protecting himself from. I love you, he said, plain and direct and certain the way he said everything that mattered. I have for a while. You don't have to do anything with that. I just wanted you to have the truth. She had known it was coming, had felt it building in the spaces between their words for weeks, and it still landed in her chest with a weight that made her breath go quiet. Jonah, she said. I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it without arguing. He waited. I did not want this marriage, she said. I did not want you. I walked into that council room intending to refuse, and I walked out having agreed to something I thought I would only ever tolerate. She held his eyes. I was wrong. Not about the beginning. The beginning was exactly what it was, but about what it would become. She paused. I love you. I choose you. Not because I have to, not because it's practical, not because the ranch needs a second pair of hands. Because you are the most honest man I have ever known, and because you treated me like someone worth telling the truth to, and because I want to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about fence lines and ledger corrections, and whether the coffee is strong enough. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile exactly, but the beginning of one, the kind that starts somewhere in the eyes before it reaches anything else. The coffee is always strong enough, he said. It absolutely is not, she said. He laughed. A real one. Not the small, contained sound she'd heard before, but something fuller, something that had room in it, something that had been waiting behind the seriousness for all the time she'd known him. She hadn't heard it before, and she wanted to hear it again. She leaned into him. His arm came around her, and he held her the way he did everything steadily, without excess, with a quiet certainty that asked nothing in return. She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat even and strong. They sat there as the stars came out, one by one, over Silver Ridge. Months later, the ranch was different. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where everything is transformed and nothing carries the weight of what came before. The practical difficulties of running a working ranch in difficult country did not disappear because two people had decided to love each other honestly. The work was still the work. The land was still demanding. Silver Ridge was still Silver Ridge, which meant complicated and imperfect and too interested in other people's business. But the debt was gone. The water rights were clear. 3 neighboring families had their land back, and Eliza had made quiet arrangements to help 2 of them through the first planting season while they rebuilt. She did it not because anyone asked her to, and not because it served any purpose she couldn't have achieved otherwise, but because it was the right thing to do, and she had spent enough of her life letting other people decide what was right. She sat at Daniel's old desk on a January morning and wrote 2 letters, one to Daniel's mother in Missouri, who deserved to know that her son's name was clear, and one to the territorial judge in Abilene with the final documentation he'd requested for the closed case file. She sealed them both and set them in the basket by the door. Jonah came in from the barn. He poured himself coffee, looked at the pot, looked at her. "It's strong enough," he said. "It's barely coffee," she said without looking up. "It is strong enough," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. She looked up. He was leaning against the counter with his cup in his hand, watching her with the same expression he'd had on the porch that evening, open, certain, asking for nothing. She thought about the man who had walked into that council room and sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and his eyes giving nothing away. And she thought about how far it was from there to here, and she thought that the distance was not measured in miles or months, but in every honest conversation they'd had, every truth offered, without being forced, every moment of choosing each other over and over again, in the 10,000 ordinary moments that make up a life. "Come sit down," she said. "I need to go over the spring planting schedule." He came and sat down. She slid the ledger across to him. He picked up the pencil. Outside, Silver Ridge went about its morning. The land was still. The horses knew where they were. The coffee on the stove was objectively exactly strong enough. They had not been meant for each other. No one had planned this, and no one had wanted it, and it had been built out of grief and debt and obligation and the kind of cold, practical necessity that has nothing romantic in it at all. And yet, here they were, two people who had told each other the truth until the truth became something worth building on, who had walked into fire together and come out the other side carrying something neither of them had arrived with. They had not chosen how it started, but they had chosen every single thing that came after. And that every quiet morning and hard-won argument, an honest word and steady hand, every choice made freely in the direction of each other, was exactly enough to last a lifetime.